All right, so we can go ahead and get started since we're 5 minutes past. I'm sure people will be still coming in. But thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Adriana Bankston. I'm currently the Chief Outreach Officer for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And this event is the second in a series of policy memo writing workshops leading up to our special topics issue on intersectional science policy with a submission deadline of May 2nd. If you attended the first workshop, you'll hear the same intro again, so sorry about that. This issue is sponsored by the National Science Policy Network and supported by the Society for Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, 500 Women Scientists, and the National Society of Black Engineers. Part of the issue is also an International Policy Memo Competition that is intended to raise awareness of intersectional policy issues that affect marginalized scientists and communities. And I'll just post a link to the issue in the chat. If you haven't seen it yet, feel free to have a look. And so within this broad theme, this series of workshops will equip students, policy fellows, and early career researchers with skills needed to write effective policy memos, addressing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all sectors of science, technology, and innovation policy. Today's event is focused on prioritizing diversity in science policy writing and is co-hosted in partnership with 500 Women Scientists. So before we dig into the memo writing, I want to just provide a little bit of background about JSPG to those of you that may not be familiar. So let me put the JSPG link in the chat. If you haven't heard of us before, you can check out the website. And so JSPG is an internationally recognized open access peer-reviewed publication. We cover every corner of science and technology policy, and through the journal, we bolster research and writing credentials for early career scholars in science policy and encourage them to engage in policy discourse and debate. We publish OPEDs, technology assessments, policy memos, analyses, as well as white papers, book reviews, workshop proceedings, and other research articles. And we also promote the publications through our global mailing list, as well as events such as workshops, webinars, and our podcast where we interview published authors. And you can follow JSPG on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel where we post all of our recordings. So we'll be posting this recording from today as well. And if you want to follow us, I'll post a few of our accounts in the chat, as well as a link to our newsletter where you can keep up to date with our future events. So with that introduction, we can move into today's event. I would ask you all to mute and turn off your video while the speakers are talking. And in terms of what to expect, I'll share a link to the schedule in the chat. I send this by email, but just in case you want to have it at hand while we're moving along. So we'll have some opening remarks, and afterwards we'll have a presentation on memo writing and then practice writing policy memo outlines in breakout rooms, and then we'll come back and recap as a group. So feel free to ask questions in the chat for our speakers. Probably would be easiest if you can send them to me through the private chat, and I can relay your questions to the speakers. So we can start with our first speaker, Charlotte Levy. Charlotte leads the policy Wolfpack for the 500 Women Scientists leadership team. She also holds a role with the editorial team and voter registration effort. And she's a scientist herself and a climate policy advocate based in Boston through her role as a research fellow in the School of the Environment at UMass. She also serves as chair-elect of the policy section from the Ecological Society of America and previously led Cornell's group on advancing science and policy. I'm really happy to have Charlotte here today to tell us more about 500 Women Scientists. Charlotte, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for being here on the weekend. I really appreciate that you all have this interest in science policy, and we're excited to have you on board. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of information on our group. Let's see, does it look like I can share my screen? I think maybe not yet. Adriana, do you think you could open that up for me?
Let me check.
So I'll go ahead and start while we're waiting for that to pop up. So 500 Women Scientists is really excited to be participating in this event because we really believe in prioritizing diversity, intersectionality, equality, justice in the sciences. And we really think that an important way to work on that is through science policy, through communication to policymakers, through communication within academia. And so I'm leading the science policy initiative within our group. And one of the things that we do is we do this kind of advocacy through writing and through this outreach. Let's see. And so in addition to learning these skills through this workshop, we're excited to, in addition to learning these skills for JSPG, we're hoping that we may be able to recruit some of you to write for us in the future. So it looks like I can now share my screen. There we go. Thanks all for your patience. All right. So again, thank you all for being here. And I want to start with an introduction to our organization using a video that uses the voices of our own members to introduce our goals. YouTube and Zoom at the same time is not working for me. All right, there we go. Thanks again for your patience.
As a Latina in science, I often felt like I didn't belong.
As a Black woman in science, I have often felt isolated and alone. I've had to work twice as hard as my male colleagues.
I have sometimes been
Ignored in science.
As a woman in science, I have often felt undervalued.
Made to feel small.
Seen as too feminine.
I have often been underestimated.
I'm here to say
And I know
it's serious, and I'm exhausted by it.
I'm ready to reclaim my space. As a member of women's
to make sure that science is inclusive for women and minorities.
In 5 years, science is truly representative of society. Science needs game changers. I am a
All right. So thank you for your patience with bringing that up, but I hope that that presentation in their own voices helps to communicate some of what we're about. That was put together by our leadership team. So I'll continue with the presentation. So to summarize what we're about, we're a global grassroots nonprofit. We work internationally as well as in the United States. And we enact our change through local efforts through pods, as well as through leadership at the more at the broader global level. Our goals are to change the face of science by building collective power, by holding institutions accountable. We really want there to be revolutionary change in the way that we're we're communicating, talking about science, the way we're viewing who scientists are. And our values are rooted in really acknowledging these structural inequalities and biases that exist. We're all about equality, diversity, inclusion, justice, and we really want to center that in all of our work. We want to push to develop and strengthen access for traditionally underrepresented groups in the sciences, and we want to step outside of our research disciplines by doing communication and outreach. And so what that means for us, and what I hope that means for you all today, is that as we're writing these science policy memos, we're really thinking about who we can serve, thinking about who the people who need their voices amplified are, and thinking about acting as scientists for communication and outreach, as well as acting within academia. So again, our mission is to make science more open, inclusive, and accessible, transforming society by fighting racism, patriarchy, and oppressive societal norms. And so the Policy Wolfpack, which I head up, addresses this by doing responsive and proactive advocacy. That means that as events come up, we try to be actively responding to them and pushing out commentary as quickly as possible. So one of the examples of how we've been working on this recently is that we were reached out to by Senator Hirono's office, talking about how the Biden administration had been pushing for diversity inclusion within the federal agencies, but there was potentially a need to push the administration to consider that kind of diversity and inclusion effort within academia as well. And especially there was a focus on sexual harassment because of a recent paper that came out talking about sexual harassment in the sciences. And so our advocacy was to talk to the members and talk to the representatives of the senator's office and push for the kinds of changes that might help in academia. And in addition to that, when they actually wrote a letter to President Biden to talk about this, we were able to read over that and give input on exactly how it should be worded. And one of the things that we really pushed for was pushing for inclusion in the language to understand how intersectionality affects something like sexual harassment in the sciences. Another one of our goals is to develop the collective political power of our membership. And so what that means to us is that we're not just a global leadership organization. We have these local pods that may be doing their work within a city, within a state. We have pods all over the world, in Brazil, in actually every continent except Antarctica. And so what that means to us is that we want to be enabling those pods to do political advocacy where they are. And so we do trainings like this, we support trainings like this to help people get their voices out there. And so we hope that if you're not already, you may consider becoming part of a pod. If you have a piece that you want to write that's more of, or if you want to turn what you're writing about today into an op-ed, we'd like to help you with that. And we do have a lot of resources for supporting editorial work and assisting people. And finally, one of our goals is to hold policymakers and leaders accountable. So that's one of our institutional goals. And within the policy section, what that really means is paying attention to the kind of legislation that's being put out there and providing input on that. So we're actually about to launch a written series addressing specific promises that the Biden administration has made when they were campaigning, and about talking about how well that they've been addressed and how well they've been carried through so far. So we'd love it if you'd reach out to us. You can get in touch at policy@500womenscientists.org. That's how you can contact our general leadership team. We also hope that you will consider joining a local pod. Like I said, we have pods all over the world, as well as having a floating pod. If you're somebody who moves a lot or who just may not be able to do something physically located where you are. And so the resources for that are actually, they're already available on our website, but we're about to launch a really great new initiative called Orca that's going to make it very searchable and very accessible to everybody. It's going to be much easier to sign up for a pod. So keep an eye out for that in the next couple of weeks because we're launching soon. So finally, I just want to say Lauren Edwards, our executive director, wasn't able to be here today. But I did want to offer a quote from her because she really is just such an impactful voice in our organization. Science and its resulting policies are fundamental to society and therefore must fully represent all intersectional identities by centering the voices and needs of our communities. So I hope that you'll bear that in mind as you're working on your memos today. All right, so thank you very much. And thank you for being here.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. Before we move on to Julianne, I did have a couple of questions to sort of frame what we're working on today. So a lot of the topics that we'll be writing about are around sort of institutional change and some of the issues that you brought up, sort of sexual harassment being one. Can you give a little more details about what sort of policy issues are important to your organization sort of within the theme today? Okay. Sorry, having all kinds of issues. Okay, so maybe that'll work. You should be able to.
Awesome, thanks for understanding my gestures. Yeah, so just to go back to that, so you're talking about like the policy issues that are important to 500 women scientists and how they can fit into this memo writing. So some of our advocacy, just to highlight some of the great work that our groups are doing, we do a lot of advocacy for, we call it SciMoms, but it's parents in science and working parents who, you know, if you're working in science, it doesn't just mean that you're trying to get a tenure track position. It's anybody who has an interest in science and really needs support from the community to, you know, have a kid, to do what it takes to have a kid and be a working parent. And so some of that advocacy has been really grassroots, doing things like making sure that academic conferences provide resources for parents, something like a nursing room, or information about who you could get to watch your kid for an hour and have that be a safe and trusted person. But some of our other advocacy has been call outs of bad policies by academic institutions. We really believe in being revolutionary with our voices and talking about things that we think are bad procedures. Another really important thing we've been doing in that category has been advocacy around COVID, because there's so much science now showing the impact that this has had on working parents. And if you have your kid at home and you're trying to work from home, there's obviously a conflict there. So that's just one example of the things we're doing. Another thing that we do is we have the Fellowship for the Future program, which brings forward early career scientists, people interested in scientists from diverse backgrounds, underrepresented backgrounds. And we give them support to do the kinds of projects that may not always be like within the traditional academic vision. So we give them opportunities to think outside of the box, to do research on diversity, to do a more artistic project if they're interested in outreach to their community that takes a different form. And so these are the kinds of issues that are really important to us. You know, these are specific examples, but what we really want is to hear from you about what this means to you. So developing these kinds of goals and projects that really represent including everybody, and understanding that what it means to be a scientist is really open to whatever people's experiences are.
Yeah, thanks for that. I put a link to the fellowships in the chat while you're talking, so people can check it out.
Yeah.
That's a good segue to my next question. So sort of around inclusivity, and so, you know, a lot of this series centers around inclusive communication. Can you talk a little bit about what that means as far in terms of, you know, how can we apply it to our memo writing?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. And I think that the answer to that can take a lot of forms depending on what the goal is. You know, in a memo, I think the specific goal is to really think about who the stakeholders are and think about it in a very broad and open way. So making sure that as you're writing about who could be affected by your policy, you're thinking outside the box. Think about the communities, think about people on a more global scale. You know, what resources are being redirected by the policy that you're suggesting. But I think that this can also be a much broader question about inclusive communication. So I mentioned that we're a global organization and we're always working to do things like translate ourselves into more languages so that our resources are available to people in a broader scope. We're often working on things about how we communicate our objectives. You know, one of the things we found is that since many of our founding members are based in the United States, we may not always talk about diversity and inclusion in a way that represents how people from Latin America or people from Africa feel like they may not represent the issues the way those people feel they need to be represented. And the best way to do that is to bring in their voices and center them in the conversation. And then finally, thinking about, you know, just the language that you're using, I think is really important. You know, one of the things we think about a lot is just the fact that we're called 500 women scientists, but we want to include everybody. You know, any gender identity is included in our organization, absolutely. Because we recognize that inclusion is broader than just, you know, female scientists. And so we do try and address that in our language and really make sure that when people read what we're putting out there, they feel like they can be part of it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Those are really good points, and I think very good for participants to think about as we're moving into the breakouts, as far as what sort of factors to think about. Great, and then the last question, and if anyone else has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So my last question is more around the concept of intersectionality, which seems to be, you know, mean different things to different people, and we're sort of trying to redefine that here. And as we're talking about these values that you mentioned, in relation to the issues that your group advocates for, how would you define intersectionality?
Yeah. Well, I would really go back to what I was saying about our mission. You know, our fundamental mission is diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And with any of those issues, attacking them from just one perspective can leave people out. And it can fail to recognize the way that being part of more than one axis of diversity can really impact your ability to be included by those efforts. And I think that dealing with issues of intersectionality requires a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. It requires people to be aware, you know, to communicate with their neighbors, to communicate with their colleagues, you know, to be advocates for themselves and for the people around them. But I also think, you know, we could also say it's not that hard. You know, we need to include everybody, and you know, it may be difficult to move institutions and make sure everybody's voices are heard, but with that as your fundamental goal, I think you can go really far. So.
Great, that's really helpful, thank you. And that will be a really good way to, you know, keep thinking about these things as we're writing today and tomorrow in these memos. So great, well, thank you so much for joining us. We'll move on to Julianne. So, so we're moving into the portion related to actually writing memos. So Dr. Julianne McCall is co-director of the California Initiative to Advance Precision Medicine, housed within the California Government's Office of Planning and Research. In this role, Julianne oversees cross-sector health policy working groups and projects, research grant making, and state government interagency efforts. Previously, she worked in public health and research policy in the California Senate Office of Research and as a Science and Technology Policy Fellow of the California Council on Science and Technology. Prior to her career in policy, she spent 16 years in neuroscience research in several US institutions, including Salk and Stanford, and conducted medical research as a Fulbright Fellow in Sweden and as a neuroscientist in Germany. In the policy space, Julianne is also co-instructor for the University of California at Riverside Science to Policy Graduate Certificate course, and she serves on the editorial board of the California Journal of Politics and Policy and many other activities as well. Julianne earned her PhD in neuroscience from Heidelberg University in Germany, a master's in biomedical sciences from UCSD, and a bachelor's in neuroscience from Denison University. Julianne, thanks so much for being here today. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Adriana, thank you so much for a very generous introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and honored to introduce many of you to policy writing. It's such a powerful skill set to develop. Let me see, I'll start sharing my screen here. Let me know if it's not coming across, but hopefully
yeah, I can see
anybody. So, okay, wonderful. So it's a policy memo writing within the context of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I recognize that, you know, there are dozens of us on this call, and everybody's coming from a very different place, a very different level of awareness. Some of you are probably living the outcomes of structural racism, and I want to make sure that you feel like you have the space to contribute and provide your perspectives. So here we go, prioritizing diversity in science policy writing, mostly a policy memo workshop. Like I said, I'll provide a little bit of context in advance. So some ground rules for the next 45 minutes. I would absolutely welcome your questions during the presentation, but especially in those 15 minutes after the presentation, where we open it up for full group discussion. Top of the list for ground rules is assume best intent. Issues around diversity, inclusion, and equity can be very personal. They can drudge up some previous trauma or any of these aspects that we don't want to anchor to one another. We want to be able to discuss it openly and genuinely. Step up, step back. If you've been speaking for a while, make sure that you give others a chance, cultivate a safe and brave space like I was describing earlier, be present, honor others' time, so make sure that your comments are as concise as possible, be respectful, and feel absolutely welcome to contribute. And just, you know, for a statement about myself representing only my life and not the office of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, as you will be. You are not representing your organizations here. We are here as individuals. Okay, so to really start from square zero, what does it mean to prioritize diversity? So diversity and inclusion, right? The diversity is the presence of difference within a given setting. You cannot be a diverse person, right? Diversity reflects a characteristic of a collective or a group. Inclusion, it was best described as a favorite educator, Verna Myers, when she said, diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, right? So when people with different identities feel or are valued, leveraged for their perspectives and skill sets, and welcomed within a given setting, that's when you have achieved inclusion. Equity, a bit different from diversity and inclusion, is an approach that acknowledges uneven starting places and seeks to correct the imbalance. So many of you, like myself, became aware of the brilliant book, How to Be Anti-Racist, starting last summer. That's equity. It's not just taking a passive role in, you know, being aware of social injustices and not doing anything about it. It's stepping into the role of correcting those injustices. So I wanted to point out here that diversity and inclusion are both outcomes, right? You can achieve diversity, you can achieve inclusion. You can also achieve equity, but more importantly, equity refers to the process that an organization can engage in to ensure that people with marginalized identities, and that's contextual, right, per location, per nation and culture, have the opportunity to grow, contribute, and develop. So it's a very active approach. And that's what you can engage in within policy writing. So I have, many of you are probably familiar with this very classic graphic, just comparing equality and equity. Equality is everybody getting the exact same. Equity is people getting what they need in order to have equal opportunities. It's a little bit outdated, and so I wanted to provide a couple more graphics that I think are more reflective. So the top bar, equality, once again, everybody getting the same treatment. Equity, recognizing that people are different, right? That there's an awareness of the diversity within a collective group organization, and steps to address those differences. Even so, these graphics don't quite reflect the uneven starting places. So this is an updated figure. Still not totally beautiful, but you know, we're going to take it. You know, acknowledging that equality on an uneven starting, like literally uneven starting plane, right, is unhelpful when everybody gets the same treatment. Equity acknowledges those uneven starting places and does something about it. So not only is the ground lower for those people with more disadvantages, but the fence is also higher, right? The barriers are higher, and this is what we see through structural racism, even when it's not apparent to those who've been able to look over the fence to the baseball game for their entire lives. So that's just some ground setting for diversity in policy memo writing. When you think about policy in general, and I can tell a little like a personal story here. My kid sister was born with disabilities. In fact, she wasn't even expected to survive birth. She's now 27 years old, and while her life is a really enormous challenge, she plateaued around the age of 7 cognitively. We have benefited so much from not only the research that's happened during her lifetime and the decades and centuries previous, but also the community support. So I tell this story because upstream, right, was the research that has taken place for the last century that allowed medication to serve her, right? All the surgeries, all the medicines, all the therapies, right? Those would have been impossible without those upstream actions to develop those services and implement them, right, through policy. Downstream efforts were our community coming together to, you know, when my little sister would be in the hospital, families would come and bring us dinner. The therapists that we were working with, right, they were the ones who were jumping into the river, saving us from, you know, going over a waterfall even further downstream. So policy reflects the entire stream, right? Upstream, and that's, you know, I love that Charlotte Levy was speaking about, you know, workforce development and holding institutions accountable at the most fundamental levels in order to have those downstream effects. But you also need downstream policies, right? You need, you know, there are people suffering right now from injustices of all shapes and sizes, and they deserve support just as much as anybody else, sometimes even more. So that's upstream, downstream thinking, applying to policy in a very practical way. So I work in health policy in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research under Governor Gavin Newsom, where we take a look at how this field of precision medicine is developing and impacting communities. Precision medicine, for those of you unfamiliar with, a very new field, essentially the marriage of big data and healthcare. So right now, there are billions of dollars being invested in biomedical and medical research for issues that might not be the most impactful to communities, particularly those communities that have been marginalized historically and currently. When you look at the social determinants of health, these are the upstream factors that impact health. Now, I heard a really wonderful expert comment that your zip code is more indicative of your health than your genetic code, right? So as the science exists right now, where you live, where you work, and where you play are more effective, you know, more impactful to your health than the genes that you were born with. So what are the social determinants of health? These are economic stability, your physical environment, including your neighborhood, your education level, your education opportunities, your nutritional access, community and social context, how strong are your social bonds in order to be resilient through adversities, and then of course the healthcare system, right? When we talk about medicine, when we talk about health, it's not just what vitamins and medicines are you taking in the morning. It's also about, how far do you need to drive to get to the doctors, or was your doctor asking more preventive questions? All this to say that social determinants of health are one example of how we can address diversity, inclusion, and equity. If people are not given clean places, without pollution to live and work, how are we expecting them to stay healthy and not, be a burden on public health systems, for example? In California, we are so fortunate to have a state-level Surgeon General, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who started 2 years ago. Many of you might know her from her brilliant TED Talk given in 2014 or so, highly recommended. She is all about social determinants of health and health policy, primarily the adverse childhood experiences. I'm not going to spend any more time on this because I want to make sure that we get to all of your questions, but just setting this up, I was extremely honored to be part of the core writing team for the first ever Surgeon General's report of the state of California, came out 3 months ago, called Roadmap for Resilience. I also wanted to mention, I sit on Governor Newsom's COVID-19 testing task force, and California was the first state in the nation to incorporate equity measures. So in order for counties to move from purple tier to red tier to orange tier that relegate which types of businesses are allowed to open, in what way, to what capacity, California was the very first to incorporate equity measures, right, to ensure that those people being tested were not just affluent white people who could afford to miss work to go get a test. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that, especially how it relates to health policy in general. Okay, transitioning now to policy writing and just an approach to policy in general. I was really fortunate to be at the TED conference in 2012 when Dr. Shireen El-Faqih, who was at the time vice chair of the UN's Global Commission on HIV and the Law, made this statement: coming up with a vaccine for HIV or a cure for AIDS, now that's rocket science, but changing the law isn't. Okay, we think that, once we make the science, right? Once we have the data, we have the evidence, shouldn't that be enough? Shouldn't the data speak for themselves? Shouldn't the whole world just stop and realize our capacity, right? Right now we're dealing with, vaccine hesitancy, right? We have these miracle vaccines, right? Developed in less than a year. And yet it's still a challenge to develop the infrastructure to get those vaccines into arms and to make sure that that's equitable as well. So while I couldn't respect Dr. El-Faqih more, you do have to be somewhat of a game theorist in policy, in science policy, like in all policy. And I say that in terms of recognizing that there are so many players, so many stakeholders in the policy world. So here we go, science policy workshops. Why are we here? And I realized that, so I have about 16 minutes more, and I am not watching the chat. So Adriana, if any of you, if you notice a question in the chat that is worth interrupting the presentation, by all means, just speak up. So why are we here? We want to make change, okay? But we also, come on. Okay, we want to make change, but we also realize that the data don't speak for themselves, right? We need to be that bridge from the science to the policy action. And the fact of the matter is that poorly translated information is simply not used. right? Just like in science, right? There's this long pipeline from fundamental research to applied research that builds on the information garnered through fundamental research and basic research. And then, through, deployment research, like how do these research outcomes interact with the real world? And then, market research, at what price point is it both accessible, but also, recognizing supply demand chains and all the fancy economics. So that's why we're here. We want to be that bridge from science into policy. Also recognizing that, policy applications of your research is just one application of your research. Okay, it's one benefit of your research, right? When you're doing research, or when you're working as a scientist in general, there is so much that you have to offer the world, and applying your research and being that bridge is one avenue that you can pursue. Doesn't have to be the exclusive one. Who are policymakers? So the usual immediate answer is, well, politicians, right? We elect them to office at the federal level, state level, local level, county level. But that's only one piece of the puzzle, and it's actually a minority piece of that puzzle of that setting. So the others are, appointees like myself, right? I was appointed by Governor Newsom a couple of years ago to advise on what I'm seeing in the scientific world toward the values and the principles that California wants to uplift and maintain. So they are, bureaucrats and appointees and, regulators, but they are also, lobbyists and advocates. And I know that lobbyists tend to have a negative connotation in the public sphere, but a lobbyist is someone who is, representing an interest, and that can be an environmental interest, that can be a corporate interest, that can be a public health interest. Advocacy, right? Advocates are basically lobbyists, but for non-corporate purposes or non-profit purposes. They play an enormous role in California. And sorry to be so California-centric with this, but I just want to make sure that I'm speaking about what I know. In California, we have about 5,000 bills that are passed every 2-year legislative cycle, 2,500 a year. Almost all of those are pushed and introduced and driven by advocacy and lobbyist groups. Sometimes constituents as well on an individual or group basis. So you all, right, could have that role in the policy machine, just like those of us who've made it a profession. It's also really important to know that policymakers are typically not subject matter experts. They serve more this role of being a referee. They are being barraged by information constantly. Everybody wants their time. Everybody wants to give them information. And so the main, if you take one lesson away from this policy memo workshop, is to keep it brief, right? There are only 24 hours a day, and your politician, just like anybody else, is a unique individual with, biological needs of, sleep and food and social interaction too. So just that you are respectful in your writing as well as making time. And I would encourage all of you, if you haven't engaged with the policymaking body, you're wanted. Your voice is needed. Policymakers, they don't have time mostly to go out and do their own survey of the situation. They rely on information coming to them because it does. Okay, what's a policy memo? In brief, it's a vehicle to communicate evidence for policymakers for subsequent action. It's a concise overview of a specific issue that, 1, examines the context surrounding the issue, 2, supplies the evidence in support of recommendations, and emphasis on evidence in support of recommendations. You're not giving a primer on an issue. You're very specifically providing evidence that all point to one final set of recommendations. 3, it outlines practical recommendations for policy action. So 1, you set up the issue. 2, you supply that evidence for proposed recommendations. 3, you actually tell the how to implement those recommendations, and then points to further materials as needed. Policy memos, as you probably know, are very short documents. You can't have everything in there. Way before you even start writing, you have a bit of homework to do. First, you have to identify and study your audience. Is it one particular legislator? Is it a body of policymakers? Is it a very specific, office? That will determine the language that you use, the points that you emphasize. If it's a legislator in your district, you're going to want to emphasize, right, hyper local issues and outcomes. 2, you need to decide on your objectives. What do you actually want? What do you want your audience to know and to do? Right? You have to make sure that that's very clear in your head before starting to write recommendations for somebody else, because they might not have the time to go do an independent study of the issue. They're going to really depend on what's written in the policy brief. Maximum 3 main messages. Okay. We're human, right? Our brain is a finite body, and we need to make sure that we are not overloading it. I think we've all had that experience. 4, select only the information you need in order to convey the main messages, like I spoke about in the last slide. Create an outline. Make sure that you are very consistent in your thinking, right, as you start to translate, as you start to build it out to a policy brief. And 6, this is often overlooked and passed by just because of time restrictions. But it's so critical to get buy-in and feedback from your stakeholders, whether they are similar organizations, that have a common interest in this issue, or anybody who would be impacted by the recommendations that you're putting forward. Okay, policy writing principles. In brief, know your audience, be concise, be clear, avoid technical language, write in active voice. So go read the New York Times, notice how that conversational language is written, and write like that. Because passive language, right, in the scientific research world, you're encouraged to write passively so that you remove your emotions, your personal bias from the presentation of data. It's complete opposite. You need to add emotion, you need to add active voice to your policy writing in order to convey a message that's powerful and that that's anchored in another person, another human experience. Provide digestible information. What I mean by this is so often, especially in science, we tend to speak and write in very lofty terms, like public health measures, if implemented for preventive cardiovascular disease or something like this, can save $3 billion in public health costs, per year. Well, okay, what's $3 billion? Like, I know that it's a really big number, but maybe you could say, like, if we save one heart attack, that saves the public health system $50,000 in expenses, not to mention quality of life for the person whose heart attack is prevented. And with these measures, we can prevent 60,000 heart attacks, right, amounting to $3 billion. So put it in terms that a politician can appreciate. And that's also, also you need to be very local in your thinking there too, right? If you say worldwide, 300,000 people have a cardiovascular event every month or whatever. Okay, well, what about in their neighborhood? What about in their district? Provide a clear layout, so subheadings, for example. Here I go a little bit more in depth. Modify dull subheadings to be informative. So rather than say, here's the overview, here's the background, here are the key findings, like use those subheadings to your advantage, so that those politicians, those policymakers who have 1 minute to scan through a 4-page policy brief can get the main messages right away. Consider graphics, graphs, tables, always with captions for those who go directly to the illustrations. And then include actionable, practical recommendations, right? They have to be grounded in the current time, the current capacities. So policy memo template. So I'll spend the next 5 minutes basically just outlining what the policy memo template is. I have a couple of examples for policy memos, and I say policy memo can also be policy brief. There's actually no formal definition between policy memo and policy brief, so I apologize if I've been using them interchangeably without explaining that. So an introduction, right, we'll always have a summary and overview for those policymakers who literally have, you know, a matter of seconds rather than an hour to read through and comprehend. 1 to 2 very short paragraphs that state why the issue is important, especially important to that person reading the policy memo. Highlight key findings and indicate whether the memo includes recommendations and give a little taste of what those recommendations might look like. Then you can provide some background, helpful background, usually 1 to 2 paragraphs. This is not going to be a large part of your policy memo. Whereas in the summary, you stated why the issue is important. In the background, you'll explain why the issue is important and provide that relevant information to back that up. State what previous research has shown or what previous policies have achieved or not in that field to give them that policy context. The next section, key messages. This is where you will present your research findings divided by issue areas as subsections. Include, you know, simple tables and graphs, again, always with captions, and referenced in the text. So if you have a graph and a table, make sure that you are referencing the table, the graph within the body text itself. The implications of the research findings, right? Once again, everything is leading toward those recommendations. This is the section where you'll explain why the research findings are important for policy, what policy issues arise from the findings, sorry for the typo there, are there underlying causes to be addressed, and is the evidence sufficient to support immediate action? You'll also want to mention whether solutions have been previously tried, and if so, whether they've been effective. Like I said earlier, that policymaker needs to know the context. They don't have infinite amount of time to go do an independent study in this policy issue area. Finally, your recommendations. I can't emphasize this enough. The recommendations must flow directly from the evidence presented. If your research is not at a place where you can speak unambiguously about the outcomes, and I mean, we could spend a whole hour lecture just about how to communicate certainty and uncertainty in research. You need to be able to present those recommendations as a direct result of the evidence. State-specific interventions or actions needed and by whom. So what is that policymaker's role, and what are the next steps, right? Does it need to next go to a regulator, or does it next need to, you know, bring in industry representatives or something like this? Reference additional support materials via links, and consider crafting SMART recommendations. So those of you familiar with like SMART goals, they must be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. It'd be really fantastic to incorporate those into the recommendations. And then finally, a brief, very brief, you know, 1 paragraph conclusion, simply reiterating what has been stated in the memo. So at the final 2 minutes, here is one example from the Journal of Science Policy and Governance about paid family leave to strengthen the STEM workforce. For those of you with very small screens, I apologize, but I wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to see the overall layout. Now, this is not in a format that you would take directly to your you know, policymaker, your elected official, regulator, etc. Right? This is a journal, right? But the content is the same. So here you have the executive summary, right? 1 paragraph, statement of the issue, and if you can see, hopefully you can. Hopefully you can see the subsections by, small letter I, political and legal status. So it breaks up the topic. So political and legal status. Section 2 is scientific and medical consensus. Section 3 is economic considerations. And then it moves into the recommendations, the policy options as presented here, providing those advantages and disadvantages, showing that, it's not, it's always a balancing act in policy, and this acknowledges it right away and addresses it directly. So this is a 5-page policy memo, and wrapping up with a 1-paragraph conclusion about the policy recommendations. Here's another memo, more in the style that you would present to a policymaker. So you'll see like the subheadings, for example, instead of just saying overview, right, or background, it says importance of the social determinants of health. How can policymakers act on social determinants of health, right? These are the actionable recommendations. And useful resources. So this is 3 pages plus a page of resources. Okay. My resources for you also, and you are welcome to these slides after today's workshop. First of all, there's a career guide that my friends and I wrote and published last year and unveiled at AAAS, providing so many wonderful resources, as well as a little primer introduction to governments and policy in general. And then just wonderful resources from all these different organizations and institutions, including National Science Policy Network and JSPG and all that. Okay, you can connect with me by Twitter, LinkedIn. I'd be absolutely delighted to answer any questions after this memo, as I am right now. I'm gonna hand it over back to Adriana to moderate, or I'm happy to, let me stop sharing here. There we go. Okay,
Great.
who wants, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Julianne. So I wanted to mention that I enjoyed the graphics. First of all, I think that was a really good sort of primer to what we're doing and sort of what these definitions mean. And thank you for mentioning a lot of things that we usually stress in these workshops, that the background and the evidence needs to be very specific to the points you're making and sort of the arguments. And as you know, they'll be working on outlines today. So this hopefully will be a good starting point for sort of a thought process around these issues that you can elaborate on and continue working after today. So thank you. So we had a couple of questions in the chat, and then I also have a few sort of about memos specifically. So one about California, whether California, other states are looking at equity for wastewater testing for COVID in addition to individual testing.
Love that. Very, very specific question. We are. There's a company called BioBot out of Boston who's been doing a PCR analysis of wastewater. We have more ACE2 receptors for that spike protein of the coronavirus in our gut than anywhere else in our body. And so it concentrates there, and it's a much more, it's very specific. You can see, changes in the wastewater, presentation of coronavirus, days before clinical presentation. So right now, most campuses are using wastewater testing, sometimes at the dorm level, sometimes at like building or like area of campus level. When you say equity in wastewater testing, I don't totally know. Okay, most monitoring is done in SoCal and larger, richer cities that say it's, got it. Yes, so California Department of Public Health has this open up the schools initiative, whatever it's called. And they are California is basically paying for all of this, right? No school, no, public testing site is making anybody pay for these. They're also mobile testing sites. Obviously wastewater testing, right? You'll always need to have that little make it to access. So it's just, it's dependent on the infrastructure available. But Central Valley, oh my gosh, about a year ago, Governor Newsom partnered with, philanthropy organizations that committed like millions, I want to say tens of millions of dollars, maybe even hundreds of millions. I haven't kept track, specifically for the Central Valley, recognizing that at the start of the pandemic, one out of five families with school-aged kids didn't have broadband access. And even to this day, that's still 1 out of 5 families with school-aged kids don't have high-speed internet access. It's just absolutely insane. But yes, the testing, including wastewater testing, is being looked at in Central Valley and impacted. I'm more than happy to send you, specific information about that, because I don't have it at the top of my head. But I know that, actually most of the population of California was being tracked in some way by wastewater testing, whether at the county level, city level, school level, or workplace level.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
I think that really puts things into perspective, sort of what's happening in the real world today and some of the issues we're discussing here. And I'll make sure to connect you with her afterwards. One other good question, which I think would be worthwhile discussing, is how do you get buy-in from stakeholders?
Oh, that's such a wonderful, wonderful, apt question. Going to be different, right? It's frustrating to get this response, but it depends, right? It depends on the policy issue area. It depends on what organizations already exist. And, one of the delightful things about, making that transition from science to policy, or making a transition from any field to another field, is that process of chipping away at your own naivety, right? To actually look into an area, a field, and recognize that, oh my gosh, there's this organization that's been around for 30 years doing exactly what I think needs to be done, right? And I've been reading newspaper articles, I've been watching TED Talks forever, and I never heard about this. Like, for example, the California Pan-Ethnic Network here in California, they are brilliant coalition builders. They know, community leaders. They bring in the community leaders, right? They partner with legislators here in Sacramento to make sure that whenever a topic comes up, the communities are at the table, right? Not just the organizations that represent the communities, the community leaders themselves. So yeah, if you want to get granular, and I think I saw in the chat, right, you were asking like email, meetings, sharing a draft with them. The most important thing is that 1 year ago, you had already established a relationship by the time you offer them a draft of your outline and you ask them for buy-in to help shepherd, a new policy issue into the policymaking process. So relationships are key, and keep in mind that policymakers have many of these relationships that are built over years and years and years. In fact, these advocacy groups, more often the case, right, they're the experts in these topics, right? The legislator or the policymaker who doesn't have time to be that subject matter expert in all the different policy issue areas that they cover, they will lean so heavily, like California Pan-Ethnic Network executive director, what do you think? What's our next best move here? Who do you think we should bring in? So yes, if you have a relationship with them already, a simple email, a simple call. Unlike science, a lot happens by phone call. In the policy world, it's so much faster and it's much more direct. When I started 4.5 years ago in the policy world, I thought to myself, like, okay, whatever task I need to do, I need to, learn for myself. And then maybe, after like 5 hours of reading, I can then call an expert and, get their information. Now I just call the expert, right? All that reading doesn't give me the sense of, okay, what's the information today that needs to inform this issue or task or whatever. So yeah, just like you do now. And, as scientists, for those of you trained in science, it's, you have so many of those skills already, right? You know, if you work in a lab, you are constantly, you know, managing multiple people's skill sets and, you know, leveraging one another's perspectives and just thought processes, right? Understanding that we all have different perspectives from which we're coming. I mean, we talk about diversity in policymaking. Oh, geez, I mean, there are now countless research studies showing that, you know, people from diverse backgrounds, diverse ways of thinking, right, make any project better. Yeah, I could talk forever about that, but yeah, really be proactive in reaching out and developing those coalitions around your efforts.
Great, thank you.
Great questions.
That's really good advice. Yeah. So just pivoting now to the actual writing. So we have a few minutes to talk about memos now. So one thing, you know, a lot of folks obviously are used to writing sort of academic style. So I think one thing that'd be worth covering is how is memo writing different from academic writing, and how do you, what makes a memo effective or ineffective from your experience?
So a universal thread throughout your policy writing and your policy presentations, whether it's an oral presentation, a policy memo, policy brief, a one-page fact sheet, is that you always need to tailor the information to emphasize why that issue, why that information is important to the reader. You know, scientific writing, again, right, it's like an active effort to remove the person from the information. For policy, it's all about people. So you need to, you know, whether that politician or that policymaker cares about, or like heads up the, you know, the women's caucus within the legislative body, or the, you know, Latinx caucus, or the LGBTQ caucus. You know, you need to, when they receive a policy memo, their you know, sometimes subconscious question is, why are you giving me this? What's in it for me? You know, if it's something about LGBTQ, you know, well, why aren't you giving this to the LGBTQ caucus chair, right? What is my role in this? So, you know, we talk about like the importance of clear format, clear layout, and, you know, enticing formatting, right? Colors and bolding and subheaders and things like this. It is communicating that you care enough about the reader's experience, understanding and absorbing that information to make it as easy for them to take action as possible, right? You respect that they are ridiculously busy. And so it's very different from academic reading. I was watching another policy writing workshop, and like the very first slide is, forget everything you learned in university about writing. Like, you need to relearn that. And it's not, you know, so far as another language, right? It's another style, but it's a language that we already kind of know, right? We read we read newspapers, right? Newspaper articles. We read our, whatever it is, you know, BuzzFeed and, you know, all the online platforms, that's written in a way that, you know, recognizes that your attention is limited and just tries to draw as much out of that, you know, that time frame, whether it's 1 minute of scanning or 10 minutes of reading or whatever. So yeah, so active voice, right? Even the recommendations, don't say, this should be done. Say, vote this way on this, you know, topic, right? Or, you know, engage this organization, right? Active verbs, right? Taking action with the recommendations or recommending actions. So yeah, and then just super precise. Like I even like, oh man, you know, 30 years in the sciences, right, has really, you know, made my brain default to academic writing, and I need to like rewrite even emails, right? I recognize how much information is superfluous that I add just because I think like, oh no, they should have all the context. They should know everything that I know, right? I want to give them all that information, but then I realize like, oh, geez, you know what, that doesn't actually need to be stated. They are trusting me to give them information. They know that I know more than I'm writing here. This is not an ego thing where I just need to show them everything, right? It's just conveying a very clear message in as few words as possible. Dr. Susan Hackwood, she was the former Dean of Engineering at UC Riverside, and the former Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology. She says this lovely lesson that, you know, it takes longer to write fewer words, right? It takes her longer to write fewer words, recognizing that in order to be concise, it does not come naturally, right? You really need to try to step into the shoes of somebody else, right? From their perspective, right? What kind of day are they having? And that's where like lobbyists and advocates that have relationships with policymakers are so integral to the policymaking process. They know that you know, policymaker has a family with someone with disabilities, right? Or has a family who, you know, just went through a terrible tragedy or something like this, and presenting information in a way that is relevant to that policymaker's current condition.
Great, thank you.
Adriana, you really need to stop me if I'm, yeah.
Thank you. No, that was very, very thorough. So we're almost about to go into the breakouts, but I want to ask this question because it comes up a lot in terms of, you know, when people are starting to write, where they can find resources, especially on DEI topics, or just generally, you know, obviously because it's not the same as academic writing. You know, where would you suggest they go for information when they're writing these memos?
You know, my favorite style of, you know, crafting any kind of document is to go find a really great example and then just, you know, model my own writing on that, right? We already are really good judges of what composes good writing or not. And having that model, you know, almost like a template, that's the process that has served me the best. And, you know, that link, you know, that page of links that I provided, which I think is built on, you know, a JSPG presentation, Adriana, that you've given previously. Google, right, policy memo writing, and you will find, and your specific topic. I want to acknowledge that you are all probably brilliant individuals, but also realize that we might not be the very first people to think that a policy topic is important. So to go do that homework, to go do that research, to understand the context, what's been tried before, and go from there. And
Right.
here's the CCSP link. I don't know why it didn't work before, but here you go in the chat.
Great, thanks for saying that. Yeah, that's a really good way to segue into the writing now, I think. As Julianne mentioned, sort of thinking about the context and, you know, what's going on politically and how your memo fits into what's been done before and all this sort of, you know, this would be sort of the next steps after today when you're getting, you know, more deeply into writing. So thanks so much, Julianne, for your talk and Q&A.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move into the breakouts. I'm just going to give a little intro. So to let you know who our moderators are, so they'll be guiding discussions around specific topics within this theme. And so we'll focus specifically on areas related to institutional accountability for diversity efforts, which was mentioned in the first presentation, how we can capitalize on inclusion and justice, not just diversity, and cultural shifts that we need to ensure an academic system where diverse individuals will be accepted and celebrated, and what that system looks like. And these are all areas that were mentioned previously as sort of what 500 Women Scientists also advocates for. So room 1 will have Colin Brinkman, who is a program manager at the US Department of State. Room 2 will be Iris Wagstaff, who is a STEM program director at AAAS. Iris has participated in our events previously, so thank you for joining again. Room 3 is Stephen Moss, who is a program officer at the National Academies, and he's also been involved in some of our initiatives in the past, so thanks for helping us out today. And last but not least, Julianne also has agreed to stick around and help us moderate room 4, so thank you for that. And so we'll basically assign each of them to a room, and then I've roughly divided you up into equal numbers per room. Hopefully you'll have a good discussion. We'll do this exercise until about 4 p.m., 40 minutes from now. And you'll have a series of questions. So I think I've shared this before, but let me put in the chat again. The documents will be working from these Google Docs. Your moderators will guide you through the questions, and then we'll come back and recap. I'll send some warnings when you have 5 minutes left, 1 minute, and then we'll have moderators report back on some of the takeaways. And then I'll be here in the main room if anybody has issues or questions. Otherwise, we'll see you back here in 40 minutes. Just let me pause and see if there's any questions now before we go into the rooms. Right. All right, looks like everyone's back. Apologies for the technical issues. That was not happening before, so hopefully you're able to access at least one of the documents and take some notes. So we'll just go through the rooms and have a little bit of reporting back. If we can start with Julianne, can you give us a few takeaways?
Oh, sure. So our breakout room focused on institutional accountability and being aware that diversity is not enough without inclusion and justice. Such a fabulous conversation from personal experiences and from awareness of recent research, recognizing that, you know, underrepresented faculty and underrepresented, people in research labs. So of course we're talking about what we know, right? We know the research setting and have some suggestions on how that can be improved. Recognizing that people from underrepresented minorities are not being promoted and supported in the way that they need in order to to be as optimally successful as possible, and not because they don't have the resources, but because the office or the lab culture is not, open enough and inclusive enough. So we were just talking about all these examples of, faculty looking at, students of color and saying, oh, great, you're a student of color. I can leverage that in my next funding opportunity, like really, exploiting their identity for their own personal gain. And that is just so wrong. So we were aware of some research on the topic of how you improve the representation within the research world. Wellcome Trust in the UK implemented a policy for their private grant making where instead of a limited submission only, which means that every university in order to apply for a huge grant would only be allowed to advance like 2 or 3 applications from the entire campus. This policy said, yep, you can still choose only 2 to 3 maximum from your choices, but if you want to advance 2 or 3 more applications from underrepresented faculty, you are welcome to do that. And trying to optimize as best as possible, those universities said, well, definitely we're going to advance 6 applications. And it just so turns out that many of those underrepresented faculty that were filtered out of the university filter actually got the grants in the end. So to incentivize, to expand that limited submission to underrepresented faculty would be a really fantastic, incentive. So that was our policy recommendation at the federal level here in the US.
Great, very
But
good.
I really want to thank the group. Wonderful discussion.
Very, very good summary. Thank you. Glad to hear that. So let's go to Iris to talk about efforts centering and prioritizing the most marginalized. That seems like a good segue to Iris from this.
I need to bring up my notes. Okay, so the problem that we wanted to address was the lack of equitable evaluation of policy that incorporate technical insights to determine which populations are adversely affected. And those include the homeless, underrepresented minorities, the LGBTQ plus community, disabled Americans, those who live in rural areas, and those who are at the intersections of those interfaces. The stakeholders that should be involved, we identified as policymakers, evaluators, the target population and surrounding community, and the excluded populations that we mentioned. Our proposed solution was that annual market research should be incorporated into the design of evaluations to ensure that vulnerable populations are identified and included. And the reason we chose that solution is because the other solution that we came up with was actually a subset or kind of like first step to that solution, which was, identifying the adversely affected populations and making sure that they are engaged in the design of the evaluation and the design of the research, and to make sure that their voices are incorporated and heard. And so that we can collaborate on data collection specifically from this group that we're targeting.
Great, thank you for that, and appreciate going through all these different aspects that we asked for. So very good, good picture of what you discussed. Let's go to Stephen to talk a bit more about the systemic level.
Sure, great. Thank you so much. And the group that I was working with was spectacular. They did a really good job of coming up with a lot of important issues. So the topic that we were given was reimagining and remaking the systems that cause harms to diverse people in academia. And so we went through and identified a couple of different systems specifically, but the one that we chose to focus on was funding and funding mechanisms, which we know adversely affect minority populations and disadvantaged populations. So what we did was we went through and identified some stakeholders, including the people that are funded as well as the funding groups. So this is both governmental funding groups as well as some of the nonprofit and private groups. One of the main issue that the group identified was that the way awarding is done takes into consideration a set of criteria that is very specific to advancing people who are later in their careers and who have established sort of a really good mechanism of building up money and getting out publications and producing other students and groups that do similar things. So one of the solutions that the group proposed was sort of reimagining the way that we consider funding and the mechanisms by which we actually, the criteria and the mechanisms by which we consider funding. So some of the important pieces that the group brought up include broader impacts, which are included in a lot of different grants as of right now, but the group that I was talking with really emphasized the importance of redoing the measurements and the way that we think about mentoring and the way that we think about outreach to the communities that are possibly affected by the specific research that's being done by the lab. So in a lot of different ways of changing the weights of the consideration to make sure that there's emphasis put on and importance put on the other groups, groups that that would not classically get funded or might have more trouble getting funding. And so we thought that these policies, you know, we didn't get too much into the details in the amount of time that we had, but we thought that these policies would be really important for ensuring the different groups and typically underrepresented groups would quickly be able to get a little bit more funding. And this might be one of the more tangible solutions that we could provide and tangible opportunities, although we do intrinsically understand that funding mechanisms are complicated. So it's important to keep that in mind as in moving forward with any policy any policy memos or policy suggestions.
Great, very helpful. Thank you. And we have a comment in the chat. That's a great perspective. I think this is something a lot of people are probably thinking about as far as improving at the system level, or, and as you mentioned, there's probably a lot of different groups that might be involved in changing the funding structure for sure. So thank you. And then Collins, the room was focused more on accountability. So we'll let you go through your summary.
Sure. And this, you know, looking at this, we sort of evolved this as we went through it, but the question or the problem we originally set out to address was to empower chief diversity officers or equivalent positions at a particular academic institution. So, you know, if this would be like me targeting my institution to affect meaningful change. So, and we came up with a number of stakeholders, like 6 or 7, not 2 or 3, you know, the funding institutions, department level DEI offices, institution-wide DEI offices, university leadership, external governing bodies like a board of regents, something like that, the faculty and academic senate, student body, non-academic staff. But where we arrived in terms of getting at this problem is that this is really an issue for that university leadership needs to address, and that the particular target, it needs to be getting faculty buy-in and fulsome participation in DEI. And so we sort of danced around a number of related policy options, but where we ended up was that it was essential that that basically some sort of metric of faculty DEI work or you know, inclusion of sort of an understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion in their own groups, in their own research groups, would need to be given value in hiring, promotion, and tenure decisions to actually, you know, incentivize faculty to actually promote progress on the institution's DEI goals. And sort of related to that would be penalizing a lack of such engagement. And we also recognize that there would, you know, there'd be a lot of sort of groundwork that would need to go into making that workable. You know, you'd need to commit significant resources to this problem. You could require new staff, changes in allocation of faculty time. Clearly, there would need changes in requirements for tenure, which would need to be transparent. As I said before, development of metrics for measuring faculty DEI engagement, training for faculty to both understand what is expected of them and how DEI will be used in hiring, promotion, and tenure decisions. Help faculty access existing outside resources, for example, grants for supporting underrepresented minority students in their research groups. Another idea was linking merit raises for tenured faculty to whatever DEI metric we come up with. But this all centers around, you know, giving equal or greater weight even to DEI considerations in terms of faculty hiring, promotion, and tenure as being the only way to create, basically to give the institution the ability to affect any meaningful change and to sustain it.
Great, thanks, Colin. A lot of really good ideas in there, and I like how these are all sort of tied together in the end, which is sort of why I went in this order. But since we have a couple of minutes, I want to just give you all a chance to, if you have any responses to any of your moderators' ideas, come amongst yourselves, anything you want to respond to. All right, well, this is great. Thank you for all of your insights. We will be sharing these documents with the reviewers in probably a couple of hours. So if you would like to add more notes, please do that, as this is, they'll be reviewing the notes that you wrote in there. So I can give you a couple hours to finalize that if you're able to access the document, or whichever way is easiest to send it to me. And then we'll have them review. And so to wrap up today, I want to just share the link to our workshop series again with the participants. So this is, I mentioned the second in a series. There will be more coming. And our next workshop will be March 13 with the National Society of Black Engineers. So we'll focus more on issues for that specific group. You're welcome to sign up for that one, as well as subsequent workshops. And as far as day 2, so tomorrow, we'll have reviewers go through these notes and then discuss with you for about an hour, and we'll come back and recap again. So sort of be a more in-depth conversation from what we did today around policy and DEI on these topics. So please do come back tomorrow. We'll be doing this at noon, from noon to 1:30 tomorrow. So thanks again. Really appreciate everybody's participation today. Hopefully this was helpful, and thanks to all of our moderators and speakers as well. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Thank you all.
Okay, hi everybody, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to day 2 of our workshop on prioritizing diversity in science policy writing, co-hosted with 500 women scientists as part of our series leading up to the JSPG special topics issue on intersectional science policy. So I'll just give a brief intro before we go into the breakouts. You'll be joining the same rooms that you were in yesterday. Room 4 will have 2 moderators because there's more of a discussion to be had there. And they have put their comments in the Google Docs, as well as a rubric that we can share with you. And so today is mostly geared towards discussing the feedback, any questions that you have, and then we'll recap when we come back. So I encourage you to ask questions. These folks have much more experience than you all have, and to an extent in policy as well as DEI topics. So hopefully will be helpful. I sent around earlier an Excel sheet with the room assignments. So sometimes we have people that come on day 2 that are not here on day 1. So I just want to make sure that everybody that's here is in the room that they want to be. Let me share this again. And I'll sort of place you in these, and then if you want to move, let me know. I can move you manually as well. So let's just do some intros. So I think this worked well last time, just so you all know who the moderators are and what their backgrounds are, what they're coming to the session with, as well as if you can state so your name, your position, and talk a little bit about your background, if you have any expertise in DEI. So part of what we're doing here is sort of learning how to write on these topics, and then something that you think they might take away from this room, what you like them to sort of walk away with today. Let's start with Parissa, and then as I mentioned, I'll sort of kick it off to you all to, when you're done, kick it off to the next person, so it's sort of more interactive. Parissa.
Sure. So my name is Parissa Parsifar. I'm a developmental psychologist by training. My current position, I'm a policy analyst with NICHD, the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development. and I work in the child development and behavior branch. I'm essentially being trained as a program analyst, but I'm a fellow right now through the Society for Research in Child Development and AAAS. Prior to this, I worked on as a year on the Hill for Senator Chris Coons on his health and education policy portfolio. I was a congressional fellow, and so I had a lot of policy memo writing experience through that. Last year, a lot of the work, the policy work I was doing was helping to provide recommendations and writing policy to address disparities. And currently right now at NICHD, I'm actually working on a trans NICHD initiative focused on DEI. And the memo that you all wrote is highly relevant to some of the discussions I've been having with colleagues and some activities that we'll be having throughout the year. So it's very much in line with what I'm doing right now. And my greatest takeaway, I think, is that you all with your scientific training and backgrounds have all of the knowledge and skills to be able to do policy work. With these memos, it's really just a matter of thinking about your audience and tailoring the information that's in there to the audience that you're writing for. So I think that's my main takeaway, and I'm happy to be here, and I'll pass it off to Jen.
Thanks, Parisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Tribble. I am a senior policy analyst with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, which is the agency in Tennessee that oversees environmental regulation and our 56 state parks. I, previous to that, worked at Duke University with SciPol.org through the Initiative for Science and Society. So I briefly did quite a bit of science communication and science policy work there. And I'm actually a neuroscientist by background. So I got my PhD in neuroscience from UCLA in 2018 and have since sort of made the transition over into environmental policy. In terms of diversity and inclusion, so I'm currently sitting on our department's Diversity and Inclusion Council. So I helped contribute to our strategic plan, and I'm overseeing some of the activities involved in that. I also, as a part of my job, work on environmental justice, so trying to ensure that environmental burdens and access to open lands and state parks and things like that are distributed equally and equitably across Tennessee's population. So quite a bit of work in diversity and inclusion. To kind of echo Parisa, I think just what I'm hoping that you all will take away from today is that you have all the skills, you have all the knowledge. I think it's really just about building confidence. And so I hope that through our discussions today, you can help build some of that confidence moving forward. And I will pass it over to Allison.
Thank you. I'm Allison Crimmins. I'm at the US EPA in the Office of Air and Radiation. So I've been there about 10 years, most of my time as a climate scientist in the climate change division. And I do some research coordination across different parts of the agency. And I'm also an author on the National Climate Assessments. Most of my work is in the area of climate change and human health. So a lot of the diversity and inclusion work I do is focused on environmental justice and thinking about which communities are disproportionately affected by climate impacts. And you probably know that we're sort of ramping up environmental justice again at EPA. So we're sort of exploring where to go next on that. I really liked what Parisa and Jen said about you have everything you need, because I also started off as a scientist and mostly do policy nowadays, but I'd also say I think it's really helpful to try to be as specific and focused as you can be in these memos, and it might require sort of giving up on some, not giving up, but letting go of some of the bigger ideas to narrow your scope and come up with really focused recommendations, which can be kind of hard when you have so many good ideas. But yeah, I guess that would be my takeaway. And I'll turn it to, I think my co-moderator, Josie.
Thanks, Allison. Yes, I will be co-hosting in the breakout room 4 with everyone. But my name is Josie Lindsay Robbins. I'm professionally trained as an ecologist. I went to Bowling Green State University, where I studied agriculture and soil health and the implications that has for harmful algal blooms and public health issues such as clean drinking water. And from there, I then was a Canals Marine Policy Fellow, and I worked with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in congressional affairs for NOAA research. And so I think this position, I have experience working between scientists and Congress, and so it was a really unique position to see scientists trying to write policy for people on the Hill. And I learned a lot about the writing process and how to distill a lot of scientific information or a lot of, really awesome policy recommendations that are based in science down to the really clear, concise message that you're trying to get across to politicians and members of Congress. I'm currently unemployed, looking for a new position, but I think that staying in policy and writing that policy between science and Congress is really where it's at. So all of you are really well poised to be in a position like that in the future. With from the room today, as Allison said, you really need to make your message clear and concise, and the Hill is always busy, busy, busy. And so the easier and more clearly you can present your information, the more they're going to actually absorb it and take away from it. And I think that's really what I would like people to learn today. And I will pass it on to Charlotte.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charlotte Levy, she, her, and my current position is as a research fellow at UMass Boston, where I do land use and climate change research. My policy background is that I've been engaged in policy since undergraduate, actually. I was able to work on some legislation for the local city where our school was located. And since then, I've been engaged in policy as a graduate student, at Cornell University, where I got my doctorate degree. I was part of the Advancing Science and Policy group and ran it for several years. So we would bring Cornell students down to DC and teach them how to interface with their congressional representatives and how to talk about their research. I'm also the current chair of the policy section for the Ecological Society of America. So if you're an ecologist, check us out. And in addition to that, I'm also leading the policy Wolfpack, so that's the policy team at 500 Women Scientists. And my diversity, equity, inclusion experience, I would say I'm always trying to gain more experience, but I started working on it at Cornell as part of the diversity group there. We were able to lead what's called the Diversity Preview Weekend, which if you or anyone you know is interested in graduate school and doesn't quite know what that looks like, I'd encourage you to check it out. It's an opportunity to learn like all the details about applying in an environment that's really fostering learning and encouraging people from diverse backgrounds. And apart from that, I've also been working with 500 Women Scientists for the past 2 years now, I think. And so our goal is to foster, again, diversity, equity, inclusion in STEM fields, and with a broad interpretation of what those fields are, just trying to foster inclusion for all people. So yeah, and what I want everyone to take away from this is, well, first of all, what everybody else said, you guys are all amazing. But second, I think it would be that, you have a lot of access to policymakers and to policy, more than you might think. And your voices really matter to those policymakers, whether you're writing something in your local newspaper or whether you're planning a meeting with a congressional representative. You have a real opportunity to talk about issues that matter to you in a way that matters. So I hope that after this workshop, you really feel like you have those tools better at your disposal.
Great, thanks so much for that. So you have a lot of expertise here, so feel free to ask them questions about policy topics. So hopefully this will be a good discussion. I'm gonna share again the breakout documents. Hopefully you all can access them. So this is the link that anyone who has the link should be able to edit. And then the review documents, which are here. If you lose them, you can come back and I can share them again. Your moderators have access and they'll be able to share screen. So if for some reason you don't have access, I can also share them afterwards with the group. Okay, so are there any questions before we go into the breakouts? All right, sounds good. So given we're It's almost 12:20. I may give you a little bit more time. Maybe we can come back at 1:10 so that you have more time to discuss, and then we'll recap. So thanks. All right, let me open. All right, so welcome back. Looks like everyone is here. So we can go ahead and continue. Hopefully you gained some valuable knowledge of memo writing from the moderators and the discussion. So let's have each moderator report back for a few minutes. If you can summarize a few takeaways. I'm gonna start with room 4. Let's have Josie and then Allison.
Sure. So I think, you know, listening to the discussion and the kind of the thinking behind a lot of what was in the document we were provided helped Allison and I get a better understanding of what the problem was that our group was trying to address. And our group did a great job with within the theme, identifying an issue that was close to home for them and they were passionate about. And they were able to then come up with a lot of really great policy options and ideas that would address that issue. And they thought really broadly about stakeholders. And we talked a lot about how to narrow their idea. And we talked a lot about how to narrow the recommendations to make them very, a little bit more concrete and a little bit more narrow, and some metrics we could measure and kind of put across in the memo. And overall, really great discussion on how to make a memo both passionate and clear and narrow with their audience in mind. Allison, did you have anything you wanted to add?
That was a really good summary. I think it was also, I really appreciate how much work went into the brainstorming of the policy options. And I thought it was helpful in the conversation to sort of think about what happens after your policy memo is published. So, you know, not trying to solve the world in one memo, but thinking about what would you do once this is published? Who would you take it to? Is it specific enough that someone reading that memo would realize, oh, that they mean me, I need to make this change. And so can you, almost like thinking about it in a marketing sense of how you make your memo specific and clear and you know, focused enough that the audience reading it makes those changes.
Yeah, thank you both. So I think those are really good points across the board. And as I was looking at the comments, it seemed like narrowing the scope and more specificity seemed to kind of be common things across the board. And I like what you said about metrics as well. So these are the things that I think all the groups can think about. Were there any specifics from your room that stood out about the particular issues you're working on? Or these are just general principles, just if there's anything else to relate to the group. Oh, hold on, Allison, I think I can't hear you.
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think at the very end of our conversation, we talked about you know, thinking about the policy memo as sort of an hourglass shape and starting really broad with your problem and fairly quickly narrowing it down and getting to the policy recommendation, but then maybe also leaving them with a sentence or two in the conclusion that sort of gets at this inspirational idea of how your specific solution will also benefit this wider group. So I think kind of balancing the granular and specific with the wanting to change the world in broad sweeps, that was sort of you know, a theme of thinking about how to do that in a short memo.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's a really good point, I think. You know, trying to sort of pull out things that all the groups can use moving forward. Sort of, this is sort of just their first time writing something like this. So hopefully this will be the start of more in-depth writing. Thanks. Okay, let's go to Charlotte.
Well, yeah, so I think my group did a really great job of addressing how to reimagine and remake systems that cause harms to diverse people in academia by talking about grant providing institutions and how to ensure that the grants given are distributed more equitably, and thinking pretty broadly about what exactly that would mean. I think that a lot of what we touched on was talking about how exactly you would target this memo. So which congressperson's office do you go into? What exactly are you asking them to do? If we're interested in targeting grant providing agencies, then how do you actually push a change in the executive branch through the legislative one? So I think that was really great, and I hope it was helpful. And I would definitely encourage anybody who's interested in learning more about that to look to scientific societies that may provide trainings on how to have a meeting with your congressperson. And again, to say that, the policy arm of 500 Women Scientists is also more than happy to help and answer questions of that kind.
Great. Yeah, I think I've seen that come up several times too. Also, just really defining who the audience is, and that obviously will sort of reframe some of this. So from your room, Charlotte, are there other things that could be improved?
I think the group did a really great job overall, especially in the time allotted. I think a few other issues that we discussed were thinking about some of the cons to the proposals suggested. So we talked a little bit about how creating metrics for diversity in these grants might lead to tokenism. And we talked a little bit about making sure that we were including the people who we were trying to represent in the conversation about what needed to change. For instance, if a institution that was not receiving as much funding did not want the perception that they were just being given that funding, but instead wanted further resources for training their students on how to receive grants, how to write applications. So.
Great, that's very helpful. And I'm glad you brought this up, including for folks that are being affected by some of this and making sure that they're in the conversation. That's very pertinent to what we've been discussing in these last couple of days. So thanks for that point too. Okay, so next let's go to Parissa.
Sure. So the group I thought had a really, great background in their memo, and I really liked their solution to addressing DEI issues, from restructuring sort of the tenure and incentive, and focusing it more on finding metrics and ways of incentivizing faculty members that are doing DEI work, so that it's also counted more heavily in tenure decisions. And I think in terms of the discussion that we had about memo writing, tying it into this issue of connecting with your audience, or are the challenges of knowing how to balance the pros and cons of the policy, solutions, and thinking about who your supporters and what the opposition might be. Part of this has to do with the purpose of the memo in the first place. So if the purpose of the memo is you're just writing a memo about a new area, or a topic that should be focused on, that's going to look very different from a memo where there's a call for ideas of what can be implemented now. And so what you choose, the solutions that you decide on, are going to look very different depending on what the actual ask is and the purpose of that memo. In that, you might have a really great idea for a fantastic policy, solution, but if the ask is for ideas that can be implemented now, and you're thinking of one that will take a long way, and a lot of policy levers need to be moved in order for that idea to ever see the light of day, like maybe something, some of these topics that we're discussing, it might not make sense to put that as your solution in the memo. And it really depends on what the purpose is that's driving the memo in the first place. So it's not a difficult thing to navigate, but I like that was brought up in the discussion. Yeah.
Great. That sounds really like a good discussion. I like the point about supporting an opposition, because I think those of us who are in policy sort of, there's a lot of this selling your idea and who are your supporters, and who you really have to know sort of who to go to and who may support or who may oppose it. So that's very pertinent to, you know, after you have something that you're ready to share with them, that you're going to the right people. So great points. One other great point to keep in mind. And then Jen.
Yeah, I think I would definitely just echo everything that's already been said. I think a couple different things that we talked about. One is just the importance of timing with these policy memos. So you might have the best policy idea in the world, but if it's not on the radar of your audience, then it's really unlikely that someone's going to read about it and care about it. So one thing that we talked about is, you know, if you have a policy memo that's written and maybe you've given it to someone and you haven't heard back, if you see something in the news, or if you see maybe there's a new bill that's been introduced that's on the topic, you can always re-engage with your audience and send them that memo again and kind of remind them of that policy idea and that work that you're doing. One thing we talked about is just the challenge of the pace of work in the government. So Parisa, you mentioned this a little bit, but government work is really slow. And so if you want that kind of quick gratification, you're unlikely to get it in this space. So having patience and realizing that things move, you know, a baby step at a time, not like a huge step in one direction, is super important. And it's really easy, especially about things like this that we're very passionate about, to write about, you know, these huge, grand, sweeping modifications. But if you can make, you know, a very narrow and compelling argument for something specific, then I think often that's the better direction to go in for policy memo writing. And then the last thing that we talked about is really the importance of building relationships. So not thinking about delivering a policy memo as like a one-time interaction, but knowing that, you know, if you build a relationship with your audience, they're going to be just so much more likely to read your email, to pay attention to you, to engage with you. So especially when you're trying to build those relationships, maybe with people on the Hill, like check in with them, see if there's anything that you as a constituent can provide to them, see what's on their radar and what's going on in their office, and kind of use that relationship building to help improve your communication with them.
Great, those are really good points too. Yeah, I like this idea with sort of what the timing is and what the landscape looks like, right? So especially if you're working on legislation or that sort of thing, you know, knowing what's been done before on the topic, which also came up yesterday, you know, really doing your research and knowing what's out there, how this is going to advance the field, how this is a new idea that hasn't been done yet. And then the relationships, definitely, I think it may be more challenging now because there's a lot of changes in leadership with the new administration. So some of that might end up being sort of building new relationships, but definitely maintaining that. And that's a good sort of overall advice for policy, that a lot of it happens through relationships. So building that and maintaining that over time is a good advice. So thanks. Any other final thoughts? All right, so thanks so much to our moderators today and all of you for participating, especially if you're here.
Sorry, there was one comment that someone made. It was an ask if there are examples of policy memos that could be shared with the group.
I wouldn't mind sharing some resources in general. So I wonder if it would be possible to follow up to participants with just an email with attachments like that.
Yes, that's really good. So I'm planning to send out the recording and the slides from yesterday, and can include some of these things. We've also posted some resources on the website where the issue is that were provided by the 3 partners. So in terms of inclusive communication and things like that. So also that's also a good resource to look at, but definitely happy to share more examples and links that you want to send with the group. Yeah.
And it looks like we have a question from Renee in the chat about how to reach out.
Okay, reach out is. Okay, I feel like, can you maybe give a little more context? Let me actually see if I can unmute you if you wanna ask.
Hi.
Yeah.
So we're just talking about reaching out to your congressperson regarding an issue that we're passionate about. So what I was wondering, we just reach out just as an individual, this is something that's important to me, or do we need to say that we're the president of the Society for Black Law Students? And this is something that is important to us as a group.
Right, that's a good question. Does anybody want to answer that? Go ahead.
Sure, I can take that. So I think it would be great if you sent in a letter, or email letter from your society and highlighting specifically that you are the leader of the society and a constituent of that state. And also if you can include the number of members from that society that are all constituents. That is going to go, much further than just sending a general letter saying, from a society. If you're from a society that has influence and your leadership or members are from that member's constituency, that's going to have a lot more pull. So I would send it from the society, but highlight in there, even in bold, that you are from that senator's constituency or congressperson.
Yeah, that's go ahead.
One thing I would maybe add as a caveat is if you're a member of like a big national nonprofit and you're writing about something that is not an official stance of that nonprofit, definitely don't attribute it to them. So I think you can say that, you're a part of that group, but I definitely wouldn't write a letter saying that like the group is behind this if it's more of your opinion and you also happen to be a part of that group. So just that small caveat there.
Yeah, I would say I think that there are things you can do as a constituent in your state and reaching out to your local legislator as sort of, if you have an issue that you want them to know about. But I do agree that these things tend to work better if it comes from a group and a sort of a organized fashion like that. So just to share some examples, let me send this, I think I sent this in an email. So from our perspective, obviously we'd like to encourage you to submit to JSPG, and this is our previous issue with NSPN. So you can see sort of what the formats look like. This is all memos, so we're sort of looking for something like this as well. So there's another question about what is happening with the work. So that's up to you. We really just sort of provided this as an initial learning experience for you all to work together. You're welcome to continue working on this. I can share the documents if you want to work in groups on these memos. You're welcome to do that, and we can continue this conversation. But as far as today, because we really only had limited time to sort of get you started on these outlines, but we're hopefully you all can continue working on these if it's something that you want to write about for this issue. So with that, let me share one other opportunity. So the next workshop we'll have next weekend with the National Society of Black Engineers. It'll be focused more on issues that their group is interested in, but will be similar format. So it's another opportunity to practice your writing if you'd like to sign up for that one as well. And then I'll just share our JSPG accounts again. One thing to note, we'll be posting the recording from today on the YouTube channel, so you can subscribe to that, as well as the newsletter link is at the bottom, where we post all of our initiatives, workshops, webinars, and other things. So I would also encourage you to subscribe to a newsletter for future opportunities. And then, like I said, we'll be posting the recording from these 2 days as well, so you can watch the presentations from yesterday as a resource. So that's pretty much it from me. So thanks again to all of our moderators and all of you all for participating these 2 days. And we're looking forward to seeing your submissions to the issue, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.